It is strange to be here and not lead worship, but it's a blessing to have people who are incredible musicians and love Jesus. And I got to tell you, it is, I don't know how much you guys have been around other churches, but it's a rare thing to have people in the church who like have a heart for worship that are willing to step up. And I meet too many guys on the road who are great musicians but could care less about Jesus. So I'm trying to put on more filters today than I normally have. My language is not always my wife always gets nervous when I preach. She's like, "What are you going to say?" I'm like, "I don't know. I have no idea." I usually have to give a disclaimer. If you guys don't know, I travel and preach. That's my other job. And so, strangely enough, I've never preached in this building. So if I say something today, I'm sorry in advance. All right? So we're going to be in Philippians chapter 3, if you want to turn there. Philippians chapter 3. Ryan always says this is my favorite verse, so I thought I might as well just preach it today since I get to preach for you guys. So Philippians chapter 3 is where we're going to be. We're going to be starting verse 7. While you're turning there or moving there on your phone or app, let me just give you this thought. It's really easy for us to try to find our worth in our accomplishments. Like that's like kind of the nature of our culture and our world is we try to find our worth in the things we do and the things we accomplish. And I think it's a trap that it's hard to get out of. You know, we could say, like, I don't really find my worth in my job, but then we find our worth in our job. Preachers will say, I don't find my worth in my ministry, and then you go to a pastor's conference, and the first questions pastors ask each other is, how many people come to your church? I started doing this years ago when people started asking me, how big is your church? This is back when we had like 50 people. I wouldn't answer the question because it's a stupid question. Like, if that's the case, then Joel Osteen's got the most successful church in the world, and he sucks. So it's so what I started doing is when people ask me how many people come to your church, I say, well, let me tell you about so-and-so and the things God is doing in their life. Let me tell you about the things God's doing through our church. Because listen, man, this isn't about numbers. This is about us joining together to proclaim the glory of Jesus. I don't know if you guys know this, but like by definition, we are not a small church. Like by definition, like there are more churches with less than 75 people in the U.S. than any other church. So like, by definition, we're not, but it feels like it because you see all these other big churches and everybody thinks like if we could just get to the next level. Listen, we're going to build a building eventually on the backside over here, a metal building where we can all have a place to meet together in one service, and I have no idea what's going to happen. Like if this church continues to grow, I got to tell you this, our heart won't change. We will not find our worth in how many people come to this church. We will find our worth in Jesus and nothing else. So I'm going to just skip to the end of the sermon and give you the punchline now. In Philippians chapter 3, and then I want to show you like how this plays out. So Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, Paul says, indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord. So here's what he's saying. Once I recognize how good Jesus is, I realize that everything else is kind of a loss. So here's the punchline. Ready? Jesus is better. This is the sermon. We could just stop and be like, done. This is it. Jesus is better. So I want to show you how he gets there, though. How does he get to that point where he's making this statement, Jesus is better? So verse 7, he says, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Let me back up a little farther and show you why he makes this statement. If you begin in verse 2, he kind of gives himself this like pat on the back. It's pretty funny. He says, look out for the dogs, look out for the evildoers, look out for those who mutilate the flesh, for we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. In other words, no confidence in what we can do in our own bodies, in our own works. And then verse 4, here's his pat on his back. He says, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Have you ever met a guy like this? You're like, hey, man, I caught an 8-pound bass. You're like, I caught an 18-pound bass. You know what I mean? This is what Paul's doing. I have more. He says, I have more reason for confidence in the flesh. And here's his list of accolades, his list of accomplishments. He says, I was circumcised on the 8th day, verse 5, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, listen, blameless. He says, in other words, all the requirements in Israel, all the requirements of the Jewish culture that says you are like a rock star, he says, I'm the rock star of rock stars. I've accomplished all of it. I've done everything better than everybody else. Here's my pat on my back. I am better than everybody else in my culture. I've done it all. I've done all the accomplishments. I've done better than everybody else. And then look at verse 7. But whatever gain I had, I now count as loss for the sake of Christ. Interesting. But whatever gain I had. Now, interesting here. He says he calls those things gain. He calls those things gain. His list of accomplishments, his list of accolades, he says these things are gain. And what the idea here is like the things that that used to give him value, the things that used to make him think that he was worthwhile. He calls those things gain. What we used to think made us valuable, he's saying we can call that gain. Or in other words, anything we find our worth in besides Jesus is what Paul is referring to here as gain. Now here's what he's saying. Our accolades, all the gains we have are worth zero compared to Jesus. All the things that we think make us worthwhile that are not Jesus, he's saying their value is zero compared to Jesus. If you're old enough to remember or have been here long enough, there used to be this pretty awesome pizza place called Shakey's back in the day. Love Shakey's. I don't know. Like that model was genius. I don't know how they did it. It was big enough where you could get tons of people in. I feel like every Sunday night after church we would go and there'd be people all over the place. The pizza was so good you had to like pat it down with napkins to get the grease off before you ate it. Otherwise it would spill off onto your clothes. They had Rojos, which why is it that white people get to name all the like Mexican stuff? Like Rojos and it's Rojos. You know, it's like El Dorado or Cristobal. It's like, you know, La Misa? Seriously? Like, I'm not even Mexican, and I'm like, what in the world? Like, anyway, so we had Rojos, which are really good. These little round fried, what are the potatoes, right? Yeah, crispy. So have this great stuff, and it was a fun place to be. And I remember in elementary school, they would give you tokens for your report card. And, you know, and so like it was a genius idea because it like made you want to get better grades so you could get more tokens. And the most genius thing they did for kids is they had like that I call it a scam, but where you turn your tickets in and you could get all the candy and toys and stuff. In elementary school, I think it was in 4th grade, they had at the top of everything, they had this giant stuffed walrus. And it was like the talk of Bonham Elementary School. Like everybody wanted the walrus. It was like if you could just get the walrus, you would be like the king of all arcade people in your school. It was like you would be the most popular kid if you could get the walrus. And so growing up, Zach Morris was my hero. I don't know if that resonates with anybody. Zach Morris from Saved by the Bell was my hero, man. And he was always doing these schemes. Like, whatever he wanted, he would, like, figure out a way to get it. And I was like, I want to be like Zach. I'm like the brown Zach Morris. I'm going to tight roll my jeans and figure out a plan to get that stuffed walrus. And so I got some buddies together with me, and we cheated. I'm not suggesting this to anybody, but we played that gopher game where you, like, hit the gopher with the little mallet when it comes up. But instead of using the mallet, we just all held our hands over each hole. So every hole was covered. And so every time the gopher pops up, it gets hit. And so it's just like tickets flowing out. It has 2 sides of tickets, and it's just like spitting tickets out nonstop. And it took me like a whole, like 2 or 3 report cards. And I finally had enough tickets to get the walrus. And I was like, yes! And I got the walrus, and I took it to school, and people were like, oh my gosh, you got it. I was like the stuff. I was so excited. Everybody loved me. I was popular. And 2 weeks later, nobody cared about the walrus. 2 weeks of popularity and it's done. I worked so hard, months and months of work for the walrus. In 2 weeks, it's over. And then it became my dog's play toy / mate in the backyard for the rest of the year. Like, help me out. Say gain. Come on, say gain. This is Paul's idea of gain. All the things that we used to like strive for that we thought gave us worth. He said when we recognize that Jesus is better, what we recognize is they have zero value, because here's what happens. All the things that we think give us worth, all our accolades and accomplishments, at some point, the world quits caring about them. Tim and I were talking about this YouTube guy we like to watch named John Malecki. He's a woodworker. Well, I told Tim that nobody probably knows this that watches. He used to play in the NFL. Well, nobody knows about his NFL career because he was probably a bench warmer in the NFL, right? He was at the peak of sports, and nobody knows who he is until he starts a YouTube channel about woodworking. That's the idea of gain. All the things that we strive to do that we think are going to give us worth, all these accomplishments, like if I could just be better at this, if I could just do the best I can at this, if I could be the best at this, it's great to work hard. But in the end, if we're trying to find our worth in those things, we'll be dissatisfied because they will never give us satisfaction. If we try to find our worth through gain, if you try to find your worth through your accomplishments, here's the reality. You will always feel worthless. Because the only thing that will ever actually give us worth and make us feel worthwhile is Jesus. So here's what he says. All the things I used to count gain, I now consider them as loss. Say loss. I count them as loss for the sake of Christ, is what he says. When he says loss, he means something that no longer has value. All of my accomplishments that I used to think made me a rock star, when I realized that Jesus is better, what I recognize is those things actually have no value to me anymore. They are of no value to me. I consider those things as loss compared to Jesus. When Cami and I first got married, I had just started doing ministry where I travel and lead worship and travel and preach. And so there were times when I would be gone like I am right now. I just got back from a camp in Louisiana on Thursday night, and I'm headed back to Louisiana again right after church today. So there were weeks like this where I'd be gone and then come home. And when we didn't have kids, I was always like coming home trying to do something like uber special for my wife because she was the only one, right? And so I would oftentimes get her flowers coming home. And there was we used to live on Princeton over by Angelo State, and there was used to be a little flower shop on Knickerbocker right around the corner. So I'd often stop in there and get her flowers on the way home. And so this one day I'd stopped in, was looking for flowers. Why are flowers so complicated? You know, it's like you can't just go in and get flowers. It's like there's so many options. So I'm looking through all the bouquets, trying to figure out what to get her this time. And this lady comes up behind me and says, "Sir, can I help you find something?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm looking for this." And I turned around and I was like, "Oh, hey, it's a girl I dated in high school." I'm like, "Hey, how's it going?" And so we start talking and catching up and talked for a few minutes. And this was it was close to closing time. And I was like, "Well, let me take these flowers." But was enjoying the conversation. I was like, "Hey, I just live around the corner. Why don't you come over to the house and we'll finish catching up at the house?" And so she follows me back to my house, and I get out and give my wife a hug and kiss, tell her I miss her, gave her the flowers, and introduced her to my ex-girlfriend. And we go into the house and sit on the couch, and we're talking. Ask my wife to go get us some Dr. Peppers, because, you know, why not drink Dr. Pepper because that's what godly people do when you're, having conversations. And we're talking, and I'm enjoying this so much. And I'm like, you know what? Do you remember, I asked my ex-girlfriend, do you remember so-and-so that I used to date before you? She was like, yeah, we were good friends. I was like, let's call her too, because this is fun. Let's have her come over and let's catch up too. So I call my other ex-girlfriend, and she comes over. She gets over there and sitting down, and I look around the corner. My wife's like weeping in the kitchen. No, I didn't do that. Can you imagine what kind of idiot would bring his ex-girlfriends home? Some of you were like so tense for a moment, like, what kind of guy is this? Like, oh my gosh. Can you imagine if you have like the greatest bride in the world that you could ever ask for, and you're like, no, I'm going to bring my ex-girlfriends back and engage in this relationship? No! Why? Because they're a loss to me. Say loss. Yeah, no one would be like, this is a good idea, right? Right? And I wonder why it is that we tell Jesus with our mouth, you're better, and then try to bring all this other stuff into the relationship. We say, Jesus, you're the only one who can give me worth, but I'm still trying to find my worth in these other things. This is what Paul's saying. All the things that I used to think gave me worth, all the gain I used to have, what I do now is I consider those lost. They're gone. I literally have not spoken to one of my ex-girlfriends since I got married. Literally not. I have zero concern. They have no value to me because I have something that is so much better. This is what Paul's saying. All the things that I used to think give me worth, now I say they're lost to me. Why? Because Jesus is better. The things I used to find my worth in are no longer of any value. They're lost to me because of Jesus. Notice that Paul's list of accolades, his list of accomplishments doesn't change. He's still all the things that he claims to be in verse 5 through 6. But now that list doesn't define him because he's realized that the only place to find true worth is in Jesus. So Paul's not saying, hey, if you're an aspiring NFL football player, stop playing football. Paul's not saying whatever career you're in, stop trying to do your best in that career. What he's saying is to stop trying to find your worth in that thing. His list of accolades doesn't change. In fact, you could argue that the reason that Paul was so phenomenal as a pastor, as an evangelist, as an apostle, was because he had this incredible background. He knew the scripture probably better than anybody else in his culture. So that accolade now is something that was a benefit for him in the ministry he's doing now. His list of accolades doesn't change. What changes is the place he's trying to find his worth and value. So don't stop being who you are. Just stop trying to find your worth in those things. I think one of the biggest traps for when Ryan and I first started traveling, that's how we met. He talks about this a lot, where we met when we were I was leading worship and he was preaching. One of the biggest traps in that world of like traveling and preaching is this idea of fame. And now you got social media. So now you got, if you haven't seen it, there's an Instagram account called Preachers with Sneakers, and it follows all these like super famous preachers who have like, you know, $1,000 sneakers. And there was a guy, there's another ministry I'm part of where I do disc golf ministry. I do chapel services for the Disc Golf Pro Tour. So I'll fly a lot to these places where the tournaments are and rent a car. And I was in Michigan last year, and I started using this app called Turo. It's like an Airbnb for cars, because I got sick of dealing with the counter at the airport with rental cars. And so you like book a car from somebody personal, and they show up and pick you up at the airport, and you drive. It's awesome. Well, I booked a car too late when I was in Michigan last year, so they didn't have a lot of options. They had like $200 a day Teslas, and then they had literally the only other car available was either a minivan, which is not happening. It's not happening. Or they had an Infiniti Q50, like luxury car, and it was like $90 a day. I was like, okay, that's reasonable with how much rental car prices are now. So I rented this Infiniti Q50. So I'm rolling in style, and I pull up to the church where we're doing the chapel, and the other guy that's part of this ministry rented a Prius that week from one of the rental companies, and he paid $90 a day, same price. And I roll up, and he's standing by his Prius, and he goes, we're going to have to start a new Instagram account. Instead of Preachers with Sneakers, it's going to be Preachers with Luxury Cars. But like jokingly, he's saying that, but there really is something to that. And you guys feel that probably in your world as well. There's something in our culture where we like have this idea that if I could just be this other person, if I could drive a nicer car, if I could have a better house, if I could buy a house on the water somewhere, that would be like the dream, you know, like if I could just have this next thing, I would feel like I finally have worth. And what Paul's saying is stop. So get the house. Buy the minivan. Buy the Infiniti Q50. Just don't let those things define you. Don't try to find your worth in those things. Pursue success in your career. Just don't let it define you. Don't let it define you. He says in verse 8, let me read this again. It's kind of a summary of what he's just said. Verse 8, indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish. Interesting enough here, this word rubbish in the Greek, it's pretty strong. It means a very vulgar way of saying poop. If you guys get my drift. This is what Paul's saying. Paul has zero filters. I got to tell you that. Like in Galatians, he says if anyone preaches a different gospel, he says, may they be anathema in the Greek, which basically means it's a really vulgar way of saying may they be condemned to hell. Like, he's like, to hell with all the people who preach a different gospel. This is Paul. And so what Paul's saying here is all the things that I used to think gave me gain, I count those things now as poop. Yeah, loss. That's how strong he is in this. Like, it's not even like, they're okay. He's like, they are so off, disgusting, gross to me now. That's how high a value I have in Jesus is I consider those things poop. Why? Here's what he says. Because Jesus is surpassing worth. Say worth. He says Jesus is surpassing worth. Surpassing worth. In other words, Jesus is worth more than anything else in the entire world. Jesus is worth more than anything else in the entire world. Again, it's one thing to say that. It's one thing for us to say, yeah, I think Jesus is worth more. It's a whole other thing for us to live it. And I think if we were to evaluate our lives, we could see the areas where we are trying to find our worth in something besides Jesus. We're trying to find our worth in things that will never give us worth. He says Jesus is surpassing worth. Surpassing worth. In college, me and a bunch of buddies at the end of every semester would celebrate passing. You didn't have to even get good grades. Just if you passed college semester, we would all get together and go out to Lowakey Steakhouse back when it was good. When it was in the cotton field back in the old Lowakey. Like, do you remember the old Lowakey where like you wouldn't even have to take a knife to cut the steak? It was just like like, oh, so good. You just take your fork, slide it through, and put it in your mouth. It was like melted in your mouth. It was so good they had to cut an airstrip into the cotton field behind because people were flying in from all over the place to come eat at Low-Wakey Steakhouse. So we would celebrate at the end of every semester by loading up and going to Low-Wakey Steakhouse. And this one semester, I think there were like 15 or 20 of us, a bunch, that were headed out to Low-Wakey, and literally all we can think about is how excited we are about eating this world-renowned steak. And like we're arguing on the way over there about what the better way to cook a steak is, medium or medium rare. We know medium rare is the right answer, but like some joker thought that, no, there's another way to cook. So we're literally arguing about the better way to cook a steak the whole way to Low-Wakey. So by the time we get to Low-Wakey, literally all we're thinking about is a steak. We're like, I'm like so ready for the steak. When we walk in the building, I feel this like butterfly in my stomach. I'm like so excited to have this steak. I've been waiting all semester for this. You know, I'm a poor college kid. Like we're splurging to have this steak. And so they had a room ready for us. We went to the back room, sat down. And instead of ordering individual steaks, we just decided to order a bunch together and we would just share it. And so the lady that was serving us was going around the table, and she just asked, sir, how would you like your steak cooked, so that they could kind of gauge how many steaks to cook what way. So she starts on the other side of the table from me, and she's like, sir, how would you like your steak cooked? Medium. Sir, how would you like your steak cooked? Medium rare. And she's walking around the table, and as she gets close to me, my heart starts pumping a little bit because I'm like so excited about this steak. This amazing experience that's about to happen. And so she gets to me and she's like, sir, how would you like your steak cooked? And I'm like shaking a little bit because I'm so excited. I'm like, medium rare. And I just cannot wait for the steak because it's so amazing. I can't wait to get it in my mouth and have this incredible experience. And she gets to my buddy next to me, Josh, and goes, sir, how would you like your steak cooked? And he goes, actually, could I just get a hamburger plain and dry? And I turned to him and I was like, dude, you're at Low-Wakey Steakhouse. You have a chance to have one of the most incredible steaks in the world, and you're not even getting a hamburger with like cheese and bacon. You want like a dry piece of meat on some buns? Like you have a chance to experience one of the greatest things, at least in our part of the country, and you're sacrificing it for a hamburger, not even a hamburger with good stuff on it, a hamburger plain and dry. I'm like upset at him. I'm like, my voice is getting raised because I'm like, what in the world? Do you have this chance to have this incredible experience and you're sacrificing it for a hamburger? You have this incredible experience to have this intimate relationship with God and you're sacrificing it for what? For your career? For your relationships? For your fame? Jesus is better. He's better. We got to stop running the rat race like everybody else. You know how the world sees Jesus in us is when they see us as people who do the same things they do, but our worth isn't found in those things, it's found in Jesus. When something like 2020 happens and the world crumbles around us and we still have a hope and we're not moping around, we're not mourning, we're still in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of the struggle, our hope doesn't wane and fade. Why? Because it rests in Jesus and it doesn't rest in finances. It especially doesn't rest in finances that the government can just say, here's the price of the dollar now. Listen, if your hope is in money, you should start buying crypto because our dollar will never suffice. Sorry, little plug. Jesus is the only place that we will ever find our true worth. And listen, if you're here this morning and you're like, I just don't feel like I'm worth anything, can I tell you, if you've put your faith in Jesus, the reason you feel that is because you're trying to find your worth in something else. You're trying to find your worth in what other people say, what other people think. Ryan will tell you over and over, one of the biggest struggles in his life is this insecurity of worrying about what people think. And he'll admit to you the reason he feels that way too often is because he catches himself trying to find his worth in what other people think instead of his worth in Jesus. He says it almost every week. He is righteous and he is holy and he is loved because of Jesus. And listen, if that's not enough, I don't know what is. I love the old hymn, the line, take the world and give me Jesus. Take it all and give me Jesus. Take my clothes, take my house, take my car, take my entire life, and what doesn't change, what can't be taken away, Jesus. And Paul says, when I recognize how good Jesus is, that he's surpassing worth, all those things that I used to think gave me worth, I consider as loss. Why? Because Jesus is better. So just in closing today, here's a question. What do you find your worth in? Today, what do you find your worth in? What do you find your worth in? Just with your eyes closed for a moment, if you'll just consider that and maybe just ask God, say, God, Is my worth found in you? Is my worth found in you? And maybe it's not this morning. If you're at a place where you're like, man, I don't feel like my worth is found in Jesus, maybe just ask him and say, God, remind me of how good you are. Remind me that you love me in spite of me. That you love me in spite of my successes and failures. And God, just remind me, ask him, that my worth is in you and you alone. God, what a joy it is to know that you haven't asked us to be better people. You haven't asked us to do more works and more accomplishments. What you've asked of us is just to find our worth in you, to rest in you, to put our hope in you. And I pray today, God, that we would be people, God, who would stop trying to find our worth in other things and just, God, find our hope and our rest and our worth in you and you alone. So God, teach us that today. Teach us to trust you, to find our worth in you.